The battle for the core. The stage has been set, and we're aware of all the details up until this point. We know what's happening, and we know what's coming. Now it's time for the second to last battle within the Ruin War. This specifically, as I just said, being the battle for the core. The Siritan Empire's final stand within their own solar system. Their final solar system. We've laid down all the details so far. First, we have Dawn's Light, far outside of the solar system simply out of necessity due to its sheer size. After that, we have the Minefield, that covers the entire outer rim of the solar system, followed by the 7th orbital path, where the Autumn and his flotilla stand ready. After that, we have the massive multitude of various different ships that are spread through the entirety of the solar system. Next is the asteroid belt. Although mostly depleted, some of the larger asteroids were cored out, and massive ship-killing artillery pieces have been placed inside of them. Finally, we have Ostengrad itself. Its 6 heavy weapons platforms lay dormant, waiting to be activated at a critical moment. The Judgment of Dawn faces to the west, whilst the Asmodeus faces to the east, both in high orbital anchor. We know all of these details. The things that we don't know is how this all coalesces into what is known as the Siege of Ostengrad. What goes down, and just how badly does the Siritan Empire lose? The first thing that the Siritan Empire find out is a transmission from the First Response Fleet. This being the fleet on the very outer edges of the solar system alongside Dawn's Light. Their sole purpose is to provide any and all information before their inevitable destruction. These vessels are going dark. No energy sources, no life support, absolutely no systems that aren't absolutely required. This way they can survive for as long as possible and give the Siritan Empire as much information as possible to fight the oncoming storm. However, the transmission shocks everyone, most of all being Isaiah. Everybody has assumed, up until this point, that the battle would start to the galactic west. The front lines had finally fallen. What remaining vessels managed to pull back in time before the Blight Plague flooded past had already rallied with the core system, and were waiting. The closest forces of the Blight Plague were to the galactic west, this being Leviathan. However, the first contact didn't come from the west. It didn't come from Leviathan. Instead, it came from the east. Isaiah and the rest of the Siritan Empire were immediately petrified. Had they gotten it wrong? Had Leviathan somehow managed to find a way around the entire solar system without anybody noticing? But upon further inspection of the information, they realized that this wasn't Leviathan. This was a different plague fleet. You see, up until this point, almost every single plague fleet, hundreds of millions of plague fleets, each one having hundreds of millions of infected vessels in them, had been utterly destroyed on the front defensive line. Even the second largest of all plague fleets, this being Plague Fleet Naga, had been crushed on the defensive line. That being said, it did cost the Siritan Empire a great many lives. However, this was a new plague fleet that nobody had ever recorded, and more concerningly, its size was titanic. Its size was estimated, off of the very limited information that they currently had, to have been roughly on the same level as Leviathan before it had broken its containment. Leviathan was so massive that a dedicated fleet, easily within the trillions of vessels, and the largest ship ever constructed by the Siritan Empire, the Dawn's Light, couldn't even hold it back. And now, they had found a plague fleet, previously unidentified, that was on the same level, if not maybe even greater. The Siritan Empire didn't have a designation for it. The unique markers within the Blight Plague's DNA, or what passes for DNA within them, didn't register under any specific name. This Plague Fleet would later be called Plague Fleet Titanus, for one very specific purpose. Plague Fleet Titanus prioritized Titan-level bioinfected, a classification of infected that the Siritan Empire wasn't even aware was a possibility. They easily dwarfed even the standard bio-titans that they were used to, these things being on the size of Pax-class war machines, absolute behemoths that easily stood as tall as the Statue of Liberty, if not taller. However, thankfully for the Siritan Empire, Titanus, despite being a colossal threat, largely didn't have much in the way of offense. Not long after the discovery of Titanus, the thing they dreaded the most was revealed. Leviathan had officially been engaged by none other than Dawn's Light. Isaiah was fully aware that this was going to be the case. The first response fleet wasn't out far enough. After all, Dawn's Light was the size of an entire solar system, a true monumental achievement of engineering when it came to the Siritan Empire, with their exotic, reality-breaking sciences. Dawn's Light would be the first thing to engage, and unlike every other time it's engaged Leviathan, it would not go down without a fight. However, going back to the other side, Titanus was displaying an interesting methodology for attack. Titanus appeared to prioritize what the Siritan Empire were calling void whales. These were special infected that were quite literally whales within the void of space, absolutely titanic, easily being on par with Siritan megacarriers. And let me remind you that the largest of all megacarriers is roughly the size of the United States of America. They're absolutely gigantic. Titanus appeared to prioritize an incredible amount of these. Despite that, its main fleet consisted of very, very few vessels that could utilize infection spires. As a result, the fleet largely wasn't a threat, despite its incredible size. It seemed to have one singular purpose: use what vessels it had that were offensive in nature to fend off the Siritan Empire no matter the cost. Meanwhile, it attempted to bum rush its void whales within Ostengrad's orbit. That way it could disgorge an uncountable amount of infected upon the world. Isaiah immediately realized that if Titanus was not stopped, the war would be over before it had even begun. In fact, Isaiah nearly panicked. He immediately ordered the Asmodeus to exit high orbital anchor and intercept. Not only this, but the vast majority of vessels on the eastern side were to come together within a massive flotilla that, once again, the Asmodeus would be at the head of. The Asmodeus itself was under the command of probably the best person for the job, this being the High Siritan commander himself, Lord Zion. Needless to say, Lord Zion, in his natural brutality, it was unlikely for Titanus to make it far. That being said, Isaiah was fully aware of how the warlord acted, and knew that there was always a possibility that something could break past him. The game was set, all of the pieces were in motion. Dawn's Light had officially engaged with Leviathan, and for a wonder, Leviathan was actually responding. It was fighting back, throwing hundreds of thousands of vessels at Leviathan non-stop. Many of them were simply nothing more than engine stacks on a massive amount of flesh and metal, simply attempting to ram into the solar system-sized target. Needless to say, that's a relatively easy thing to do, if it wasn't for Dawn's Light's void shields. Every single time they would connect the shields, they would instantaneously obliterate themselves, such is the nature of the shields. The entire time, Dawn's Light is unleashing salvo after salvo out of its standard lance batteries, each one strong enough to destroy worlds, with a single shot. Leviathan was receiving an absolute pummeling, but it seemed as though Leviathan was absolutely sick of Dawn's Light getting in its way, as, once more, it stood in its path. However, it didn't take very long, no more than a couple of days, before Leviathan went back to its old tricks, simply going around Dawn's Light as if it was nothing more than an island within an ocean. It was then that information was being sent to the Siritan Empire that concerned Isaiah even more than what he was already getting. Dawn's Light was reporting a size that the Siritan Empire hadn't even believed was a possibility. You see, when the Siritan Empire originally encountered humanity, and they had given them all of the information on what they believed Leviathan to be, they had estimated that Leviathan was nearly, at a very minimum, twice its original size. Its original size was already enough of a problem, but now if it was twice its original size, that was a critical situation. However, as more and more vessels passed by Dawn's Light, more and more vessels circumnavigated what is essentially a solar system, the truth became obvious. This wasn't 2 times larger. This wasn't even 5 or 7 times larger. Dawn's Light had no end in sight when it came to Leviathan passing by, and it had already calculated that Leviathan was more than 15 times larger than it originally was when it broke from containment. The situation was far more dire, far more critical than anybody had dared to imagine. Leviathan would not be stopped. Isaiah knew within that very instant that there was nothing he could do. There was no plan, no strategy, no gun that was big enough to take down Leviathan. Leviathan would steamroll into Ostengrad, and there would be nothing left but a barren rock by the time it was done. No biological material, no mineral deposits, no atmosphere. Ostengrad was dead before the battle had even begun. However, the Winter General more or less was undaunted. He knew that this was an inevitability, but he also knew that he wouldn't be able to live with himself unless he made Leviathan pay in blood. As a result, he immediately ordered the Autumn, as well as the rest of its flotilla, to use skip jumps to exit the solar system itself, going beyond the minefield and immediately begin engaging with Leviathan. However, this wasn't a doomed advance. This wasn't an attempt to stall Leviathan. At this point, there was nothing that could stall it. Rather, this was an attempt to take out Leviathan's heaviest, most important pieces from the board. The Autumn and its flotilla were tasked with targeting the Void Whales. If they could get rid of enough Void Whales, they could massively limit the amount of damage it could do to Ostengrad. The majority of the smaller vessels were designed for void combat. As a result, they didn't hold much biomass that could actually be deposited upon Ostengrad. Not only this, but Dawn's Light was given the same order, although it did take roughly a day for the transmission to arrive. It had the same objective. Ignore the smaller targets. If they could, take them down, but they're not a priority. Focus on the Void Whales. Kill as many as you possibly can. And as a result, they set about to their grim task. At this point, roughly a month has passed. The Autumn and its flotilla were forced back within the solar system to the seventh orbital path. It's around this time that Leviathan has finally hit the minefield, and the amount of damage that is caused to Leviathan is honestly negligible. The Siritan Empire had originally intended this to deal a crippling blow to Leviathan, assuming that Leviathan would be small enough and underestimate the minefield that it'd be able to do a catastrophic amount of damage before Leviathan became wise to the tactic. But now, the fact of the matter is that the mines did absolutely nothing. Leviathan could easily afford the complete and utter destruction of its front vanguard, simply because there were so many more vessels behind it. What of it if it lost a few million vessels? There was an uncountable amount behind it. It was nothing more than losing a single drop of water out of a bucket full of it. Leviathan was not stalled. Leviathan was not daunted. The Autumn, its flotilla, and Dawn's Light continued its grim task. Meanwhile, almost every single vessel within the solar system was now in some way, shape, or form en route to the galactic west, or I guess at this point, the solar system's western side. It's only now that a brand new, chilling bit of information comes through. These are coming from the rest of the first response fleets around the entirety of the solar system. They're reporting massive tendrils of Blight Plague fleets inbound, each and every single one of them holding the same markers as Leviathan. Leviathan isn't just coming from one side. It has quite literally spread out a claw around an entire solar system, a solar system that is nearly 1.5 times larger than the Milky Way solar system. Leviathan's size is unfathomable. At this point, there's no numerical value to how many vessels it has at its disposal. It's easily calculated that the Leviathan is easily 50 to 100 times larger than its original size. If the Siritan Empire had rallied every single force at its disposal back before all of this was going down, they may have been able to prevent this. It would have costed them their entire navy, but they might have been able to take down Leviathan. But at this point, it was like a child trying to fight a god. And the Siritan Empire were not going to weather the storm. More and more Leviathan closed in on Ostengrad. The asteroid belt immediately opened fire when range was attained and was very quickly overwhelmed. The majority of the Siritan Empire's navy still persisted around Ostengrad itself. It was at this point that the Siritan Empire unleashed a very special secret that very few within the Navy and very few within the military at large was aware of. The planet Zadrian III, the third planet within the core system, had actually long ago been completely excavated out. The planet itself was nothing more than the shell, the crust. By all understanding of physics, the crust should have collapsed in on itself long before it reached this point. But the core and mantle of the planet had been reinforced through unknown sciences. The entire planet had essentially been turned into a quite literal planetary-sized artillery piece. And, wouldn't you know it, Isaiah's planning was impeccable. The exact date that this modification to Zadrian III was undertaken is unknown. It certainly wasn't within the 40 years that the Siritan Empire was holding the line at the defensive line, as an undertaking like this would likely take thousands, if not tens of thousands of years to do, even with a society as advanced as the Empire. However, Zadrian III's orbital path at this specific moment in time just so happened to be on the western side of the solar system, directly in the face of Leviathan. Massive tectonic plates on the surface of the planet spread apart, visible even from far away from the planet. Out from it came an impossible number of planetary to orbital defense cannons. The Siritan Empire was quite literally willing to destroy one of their worlds in an opening volley that may or may not deal devastating damage to Leviathan. Due to the nature of the planet, it likely wouldn't survive its first salvo, and shockingly, the Siritan Empire was willing to do this, as that is exactly what happened. Zadrian III unleashed its hellish payload. The crust of the planet, or what remained of the planet, immediately splitting in half and collapsing in on itself due to the structural bracing not being capable of handling the forces that were put upon it. Despite the utter destruction of the planet, it dealt a devastating blow to the front lines of Leviathan. Originally, Leviathan had just crossed the asteroid belt. It was about halfway to Austengrad at this point. At this point, however, after the firing of Zadrian 3, the entirety of Leviathan was pushed back to the 6th orbital path. This had bought the Cibertan Empire an incredible amount of time that they could use to prepare, but at this point, the question was, prepare what? They had already exhausted one of their most powerful weapons that they had at their disposal. Zadrian 3 was gone, and whilst it dealt devastating damage, it could not be used again. Dawn's Light was only capable of doing so much, and against the unbelievable swarm of vessels, the Cibertan megacarriers could do very little, or at least the 3 that still survived. It's at this point that I'm starting to realize that we need to talk about some of the megacarriers and what exactly happens to them. We know of the 3 that managed to survive, these being the Judgment of Dawn, the Asmodeus, the replacement of the Warstock, as well as the Autumn. However, what happened to the Aurum, and what happened to the Eternity? And more specifically, some of you may be questioning, what about the Imperium? The answers to these are simple. The Eternity was utilized non-stop. When the Cibertan Empire was first invaded, the Eternity went to various different worlds of high importance and got as many people out as possible, ferrying them further and further into the system. As it became more and more evident that falling back further and further towards the Cibertan core was simply not an option due to the loss of indescribable amounts of territory, the Cibertan Empire pivoted hard and started making massive fleets on a near constant basis, utilizing the civilians that they had evacuated from their territory thanks to the Eternity as the new crew of these fleets. Eventually, it got to the point where attempting to get civilians off-world before the Blight Plague appeared wasn't an option. The Blight Plague was coming too fast, and there were far too many cries for help. The Eternity could do nothing to help them. As a result, the Eternity was retrofitted and turned from its normal world ship configuration and was now given a massive plethora of guns. Unfortunately, the superstructure of the Eternity was never meant to handle weapons. It was designed as a world ship. It was designed to ferry people from one planet to another and keep them sustainably and happily alive on board. The very structure of the vessel was never intended for weapons to be fired on it. As a result, the first time the Eternity opened fire, it ended up damaging itself. Crews would immediately set about repairing it. Unfortunately, this ended up becoming an endless cycle until the Eternity was eventually overwhelmed. In a desperate attempt to ensure that the Blight Plague didn't gain access to a megacarrier, as unthreatening as the Eternity was, they ended up detonating the Solstite reactor on board. This ended up vaporizing the entire universe it was in thanks to the hypervolatile nature of a Solstite reactor. And whilst it did cataclysmic damage to the overall forces of the Blight Plague, it also instantly vaporized an untold number of Cibertan vessels. The decision was not made by any of the higher-ups and was incredibly rash. The only thing that Isaiah can think of is that the crew and the captain of the Eternity forgot just how volatile Solstite really was. As for the Aurum ended up not playing a major role whatsoever. In fact, the Aurum itself had ended up becoming stripped for parts. Due to the volatile nature of Blight Plague, it didn't seem logical to fire interceptors and corvettes after them. Whilst the corvettes would certainly be useful in taking down their smaller vessels, they didn't have the speed nor the maneuverability of an interceptor to avoid becoming infected. As for the interceptors, whilst they did have the speed and the maneuverability, they completely lacked the damage that a corvette could do. As a result, As a result, early on into the Ruin War, the Siritan Empire outright banned the use of fighter craft, and the Abram was decommissioned and disassembled, its parts and its various different materials being used to fuel the new fleets that were being created. Finally, we have the HMSS Imperium. The Imperium actually wasn't constructed until after the Ruin War. When I originally did a video on the Siritan Navy, I had said that it was made, I believe I said during the 28th or 29th Siritan Empire, but that was actually incorrect. I remembered it after the fact. The Imperium was actually made during the 33rd Siritan Empire, the events of the Ruin War happening during the 32nd. As a result, the Imperium doesn't exist yet. Now that we're aware of the fates of each of the mega carriers, we can get back to the battle for the core. And unfortunately, the situation is more dire than it was before we left. At this point, Leviathan has easily reached within the orbital path of Ostengrad and Thalcia. That being said, it still has a long way to go before it can reach Thalcia itself. Looking towards the east, Zion, more or less with his flotilla, has been completely successful. He has lost nearly 50% of the ships that were at his disposal. However, Titanus has been cracked. The fleet itself is actually, for the first time ever when it comes to Blight Plagues, in full retreat, leaving the core system. Zion isn't particularly confident about this fact, as he believes it will come back, and stations a few vessels there just in case to give them a heads up. Meanwhile, the entirety of what remains of the flotilla, as well as Zion himself and the Asmodeus, are en route to assist the Judgment of Dawn in the defense of Ostengrad. Needless to say, the situation is not looking good. The vessels of the Siritan Empire stand absolutely no chance. Leviathan's intelligence is far superior to what anybody had believed was possible. At this point, its intelligence is completely unfathomable, and it has modified its own vessels so that its infection spires easily outrange almost every single gun of the Siritan Empire. They're falling like moths to a flame, and there's not a damn thing the Siritan Empire can do. Dawn's Light, for a very long time, has been utilizing its forward-facing shield, such as the nature of the Judgment, to provide fleet-wide defense. However, unfortunately, this defense can only go so far. Leviathan very quickly understands where the power of this shield comes from and immediately starts assaulting the frame of the shield. After breaking a small segment, the entire shield collapses, and the front third of the vessel returns to the Judgment of Dawn, from which point it starts opening up on its broadsides in a desperate attempt to hold back the Blight Plague. It's about the point in which Leviathan is about to start entering high orbital anchor that the Asmodeus finally arrives, and whilst its firepower is certainly helpful, it's not enough to hold off the storm. However, despite all of this, the Judgment of Dawn and the Asmodeus end up becoming their own little micro-islands in orbit, unleashing hellish amounts of fire and holding back Leviathan at the very least from infecting them. However, unfortunately, their weight of fire is completely incapable of preventing Leviathan from entering high orbital anchor. It's at this point that a number of void whales manage to make it to low orbital anchor and start disgorging Blight Plague biomass onto the surface of Ostengrad. It is at this point that Isaiah decides that it is time. He activates the heavy weapons platforms and unleashes the particle cannons mounted to them upon the void whales that are in orbit. He manages to destroy a significant amount of them before Leviathan notices what they are and immediately destroys them. They do not last long, and the fact of the matter is that it's not a great loss. Due to the nature of these particle cannons, they can only fire so many times before their battery charges were completely exhausted. At the very least, they loosed the majority of their shots that they could have. It is now time for the siege of Ostengrad. And unfortunately, that is where we're going to be leaving this episode. It is an incredibly short episode due to the fact that the Silverton Empire really didn't last very long. As a matter of fact, as I'm looking at the time, we're actually in half of an episode right now, sitting at a half an hour rather than the usual hour long. Unfortunately, there's not really anything else I can talk about without getting into the siege itself, and there is a lot of information to cover there. So I hope you guys enjoyed this admittedly shorter episode, simply because there's not really anything else to talk about. In the next episode, we're going to be getting into the Siege of Ostengrad, and I do want to remind everybody that this will be taking a different format. We're not going to be talking about the various different bits of lore. I'm going to try and turn this into an actual story. Keep in mind, I am not an author, and most of this is going to be made up on the fly from information that I can remember. So don't expect anything too grandiose. Furthermore, I'm going to attempt to do the voices of a number of the different characters. However, due to the mic that I have, some of those may end up sounding a little weird. So keep that in mind as well. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys are looking forward to Saturday and Sunday's live streams at noon Central Standard Time, where we're doing RimWorld and Sunday Night Live, respectively, where I pick a random game and we game it out. Coming right back here next Tuesday with, finally, after so long, the Siege of Ostengrad. So, until then, guys, see ya.